simply go ahead and say, well, a maximally excellent being is coherent. Instead, you have to show that a maximally great being is possible. You have to understand, the possibility operator is not scoped over the exemplification of maximal excellence, but the exemplification of necessary maximal excellence. And unfortunately, the latter is purely incoherent. And the final reply I can see by the defender of the modal ontological argument is to simply say that God is, by definition, perfect, and a perfect entity could not possibly be non-necessary. And like the first reply, this strikes one as puzzling and deficient in various respects. First of all, what I want to point out is something that's rarely pointed out in the first place. What does perfect even mean in this context? And I'm not trying to be obtuse or stupid here. What I'm trying to say is that perfect is typically defined in terms of a relation or relative to some standard. Okay, the notion of a perfect score. Okay, a score is perfect because there's some intrinsic maxim. There's something. There's like a range of scores. Okay, and there's a maximum score. Okay, and so that we call that the perfect score. Okay, so what could it mean to be really perfect or absolutely perfect or perfection without reference to any sort of standard? So you're just immediately struck by the obscurity of the claim. Okay, it can't simply do to say, well, you know what? It's perfect in the sense that it's the maximum of power, the maximum of knowledge, and the maximum of morality. Because then what is that? Doesn't answer the question even then. Because what does the point of something being perfectly powerful, perfectly knowledgeable, and perfectly moral have to do with entailing its necessity? Okay, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, the description, it truly being perfect, okay, doesn't seem to arise at all. There's nothing relevant about that seems to arise. Okay, so you have to understand, like, there's nothing about the term perfection that strikes one as even remotely, remotely understandable. It's a rather opaque or obscure claim to assign here. And even if we pretend for the moment that perfection, absolute perfection, is coherent, alright, why suppose that it entails necessity? Now remember, necessity is a trans-world modal property. Now, given actualism, only one world is actual. Okay. Now, contingent God doesn't differ in any respect to a necessary God in the actual world. I mean, it's difficult, in any meaningful sense, why perfection should entail necessity. Okay? At the very least, you can't simply assert it. Alright? I mean, some defense is required. You can't just hand-wave your way through the philosophical argumentation. People used to do that in the past. This is the modern times, modern analytic philosophy, where a lot of rigor is applied. Okay? So you can't just hand-wave your way and say, well, perfection entails necessity, therefore, God by definition is perfect and the rest of the claim. They have to defend this argument because a contingent God does not differ in any real respects to a necessary God because only one actual world exists. If a contingent God exists in the actual world, it doesn't differ in any real respects to a necessary God in the actual world. Okay. Now, even if we accept that God is by definition perfect, whatever that means, and that perfection entails necessity, whatever that means, this doesn't prove that God exists. Now, recall the former two objections and why they failed. Showing a particular definition is as thus doesn't show that the definition is ever satisfied or the concept ever exemplified. So our defender here is still left with the problem of showing there to be a necessary God. In other words, he's left with the same problem. Pointing out the coherence of maximal excellence is deficient, as I mentioned earlier, he must show that maximal excellence is necessarily exemplified. And I argued that was incoherent in the same sense that necessary unicorns, necessary golden mountains, and so on and so forth are incoherent. Now, here perhaps the defender will say, well, you know what? Maximal excellence entails perfection, and perfection entails necessity. Okay, now the same objections will apply. Necessary maximal excellence means that maximal excellence could not possibly fail to be exemplified. So the objector to the defender could simply say, well, you know what? Maximal excellence is possibly not exemplified, therefore necessary maximal excellence is not exemplified. So you're still left puzzled by this deficient line of argument. It's clear that none of these lines of arguments take to task the incoherence of necessary maximal excellence. The entailment proposed by the objector is necessarily false because, remember, an entailment is true if and only if the consequent is true. An entailment is nothing more than a necessary material conditional. Okay, so if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, then the material conditional is false and hence the entailment is false. Since the consequent here, that maximal excellence is necessarily exemplified, is false, but not only that, necessarily false, and the antecedent, maximal excellence being possibly exemplified, is true, barring the incoherence of omniscience, omnipotence, or moral perfection, which can have respectable arguments, which there are respectable arguments for. Therefore, the supposed entailment is false, because here we have a true antecedent, but a false consequent. We have that it's possible that maximal excellence is exemplified, but we have that it's false that maximal excellence is necessarily exemplified. Therefore, the entailment that the objector makes is simply false in the first place. So the defender of the modal ontological argument simply doesn't take to task the challenge of showing the coherence of maximal greatness at all. And finally, it's worth pointing out that there are powerful, really good arguments against God's necessity, let alone his actual existence. For instance, as I'm going to argue in my 7th paper, there are sound logical problems of evil, and theodicies and morally sufficient reasons are impossible for God to have. Okay, I'm going to argue that quite extensively in my 7th paper. Then that, of course, entails that God can't be necessary, since therefore God wouldn't exist in worlds containing evil, and therefore God's not necessary, because there are worlds containing evil. And then, of course, there are multiple other arguments to have, which are just versions of asserting correctly that God's non-existence is impossible. For instance, one popular argument seems to be if God's necessarily existent, gratuitous evil is impossible, gratuitous evil is possible, hence God is not necessarily existent. Modus tollens. And finally, as I'll elaborate in my next paper, God's necessity either lends itself to the failure of theism as a hypothesis, or the absurdity and the logical contradiction that the actual world is the only possible world. In other words, modal collapse / modal fatalism. And I'm going to argue in detail why it's logically contradictory. And so you're basically left wondering why even accept God's necessity at all. There are plenty of compelling reasons to reject it. And finally, I'd like to reflect in the 5th section of what his argument even shows in the first place. Some people take it as showing there to be a necessary God, and even people that are detractors of the modal ontological argument grant that. I actually don't think that's the case. I'm not sure if this objection's been made in the literature. Now, recall that if planting this argument's successful, it established that maximal excellence is necessarily exemplified. However, it notes what's specifically absent, that a specific individual entity is necessary. His argument shows that there is a exemplification of maximal excellence in every particular world, that some being exemplifies maximal excellence, but not any particular entity that exemplifies maximal excellence. Okay, so for instance, suppose we pretended for a second that it's necessary that there be a bachelor in every world. It doesn't show that any particular bachelor is necessary. Okay, John could be a bachelor in world 1, and Joe could be a bachelor in world 2. Okay, there's no particular entity which is necessary. And as I'm going to argue in my next paper on the modal cosmological argument, an entity that takes some course of action in some particular situation, and an entity that takes that same course of action, that takes some other course of action, in the identical situation, are not and cannot be the same entity. Hence, the fact that an entity with a specific set of conditional propositions of freedom exemplifies maximal excellence would be wholly contingent, and hence that entity, this entity, not that entity, this entity as opposed to some other entity, is itself contingent. So because we're left asking, well, why did this entity